Good deal. Well, yeah, as we have some more folks joining us, we're gonna go ahead and get started this morning. So thank you for jumping on the call for our 201 aerial webinar session. Getting a little more in depth than our previous session, but it's brought to you from our Midwestern Range and Pasture team, and we'll have a chance to dive into a little bit more of the bios of our presenters when it comes to their session. So we'll hold on to that, but. Quick introduction to myself. I'm Spin Oliver. I'm the Associate Territory Manager, um, primarily covering Minnesota and Wisconsin, focusing on the range and pasture side. Been doing this for just over a year, so looking forward to getting into this session and seeing how we can support aerial applications in the upper Midwest. So I briefly mentioned the 101 session that happened 2 weeks ago. So if you registered for this webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email here in about a week or so with links to both our 101 and our 201 session. Um, or you can search on YouTube or Google Corteva Pasture Aerial Application 101, and you'll be able to find it there to watch the recording and get caught up. But we kind of went more over the basics, so diving into more what Corteva is and kind of how we support our range and pasture customers and providing high quality products there. So feel free to go back and watch that recording and get caught up to where what we're going to cover today. So the next 45 to 60 minutes, we're going to walk through kind of how we can communicate the value of weed control to a producer and promoting your services that you provide on their pasture acre, as well as kind of troubleshooting applications, what may have went wrong, what impacts a successful application, and then diving into more of the science and the details behind adjuvants and how that can tie into keeping herbicides on target. And then we'll wrap it up with how you can partner with Corteva to grow your operation and grow your customer base on the pasture acre. Um, so that'll be our agenda for today, and we're looking forward to getting into it. And if y'all have any questions over the course of the presentation, you'll see a Q&A icon on the menu. So feel free to click that button, drop your questions in there, and if it makes sense to tackle the question in the moment, we'll do that, or we'll tackle it at the end during that specific time. So before I turn it over to Tanner to start, wanted to kind of brush through the maps of who may be on the call. Um, and you'll see the range and pasture specialist name on the map that covers the area you're in. And while we're here, if you wouldn't mind on the call, if you wouldn't mind typing in the chat feature where you're calling from, just kind of out of curiosity, would love to see where everybody's from and what kind of market y'all are working in. So take the next couple of minutes as Tanner introduces himself to put that in the chat, and we'll get started with that.
Awesome. Thank you, Spen. I already see a few folks I recognize from my area on the call today, so it's good to have you here with us. Like Spen said, my name's Tanner Smith. I am the range and pasture specialist for the upper Midwest area, so I cover primarily the eastern side of the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. I reside in Sioux Falls, South Dakota currently, and I've been working for Dow AgriSciences, now Corteva, since about 2017. And really, my passion is in this business. Not so much of a row crop guy myself. Grew up on a uh, Black Angus ranch and worked in this business since starting. So this is where my passion is. And today I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk through communicating the value of weed control to a producer. Okay, first off, especially for guys in my area, there's a lot of crop acres these days, torn out a lot of the prairie, a lot of pastures to grow crops. And there's always a need for an increased yield on that space. And, many people recognize those pictures on the left of measuring, the bushels gained per acre and the quality of it as well. And it'll be no stranger to cattle producers as well. The pictures on the right of increasing the weight on cattle and how do we do that? And it's really the crop of grass that's out there and the amount of forage and also the forageability of that forage as well. So, that last stat there can be, the species of cattle you're using. It could be, the quality of the feed you have, could be the environment that you're in. There's many factors that go into that. And one I'm going to focus on here is weed control to increase the production of grass that leads to the increase of weight on cattle. So, like I said, more grass in the pasture. The idea there for that investment is to increase the weight in the cattle. So, look at this picture here on the screen and imagine to yourself how a cow or really any class of livestock would pick through this pasture and eat the grass. This is a pretty heavy infestation of weeds, and notice kind of how sparse that grass is. Basically, the idea is by spending some money on a product like a Duracore or a Graze on Next or any of our Tordon products, reducing that stand of weeds and brush or whatever it is and increasing that grass around there, which would therefore yield to an increased stocking rate, potentially improved productivity per acre, extending the grazing season, and also eliminating certain weeds that can be toxic that either cause complications um, for gestational cattle, or for also making them sick, so their productivity of putting on weight per day is reduced. Here I have another picture to kind of demonstrate a before and after of a herbicide application. So it's no secret that it costs some money to buy the product and also to pay for an application, especially when we're talking, out of an airplane or a helicopter or maybe even a drone. Here on the left, we look at when a herbicide was applied to this particular pasture. We measured over 5.5 tons of forageable material per acre, which would equate to about 1.1 animal units per acre in this scenario. I believe this picture is taken from a Missouri pasture, but we could really replicate this in any region. The story would really be the same. And then here on the right, no herbicide. So notice, a lot of weeds there, and in that small bag is what would be forageable. More than half reduction in that case. So this is the value of using a herbicide to manage those weeds and increase the weight gain on those cattle. All right, the second point I'd like to make here is the other option for weed management is typically going to be mowing. Mowing is going to vary, the cost, and there's many factors there, but usually when we start breaking it down, running a pencil here, 15 to 25 bucks an acre. It's probably pretty fair per mowing, right? If any of you have seen a selective mower, please call me today. It's something I could definitely sell. It's not something that's available to my knowledge. The cost of a herbicide plus application fees is usually going to be about one of those. So 15 to 25 bucks per acre per year is a pretty common way to measure that. It's way more effective for weed control. Mowing could take 2 to 3 times depending on the pressure of your weeds, what you have going on. You really want to use that mower to reduce the amount of seeds being developed. So you got to get out there every time that plant, tries to make another seed again. Also, if you mow your own lawn, you notice that as you mow, those weeds get pretty smart and they start to flower earlier and shorter, which gets even harder to manage them in later seasons. So really, it's not hard to see that mowing, as far as weed control goes, is pretty ineffective. And again, that inselectivity part, you're going to be reducing your grass, which is going to hurt your bottom line as well. The cost of hay. So if you are having less grass to graze during season, may result in needing more hay later to keep those animals fed. Hay is very expensive, both the cost of it and feeding it. You need to really have your cows in a centralized location to facilitate the ease of feeding them, causes a lot of more issues. You need to turn a wheel a few more times. It just in all regards is going to be more expensive than just growing that grass out on your own ground. Advance their spend. In summary, there's really three things I'd like to pound home today when talking with producers. And these are facts you can really hang your hat on here. Is about 1.5 pounds of grass replace each pound of weeds removed from a pasture. Okay. Also, with those fewer weeds, increase the grazable acres. Managing those pastures effectively can reduce that supplemental feed cost need. So those would be the three things that would be the benefits of using a herbicide versus mowing or doing nothing really. All right, now I'm going to transition into a little bit of troubleshooting. So we've set the story of using a herbicide, the benefits for it. Now we go out with a herbicide. You guys are no strangers to applying this, and you've seen herbicide applications not meet expectations in the past. So I want to kind of go through a few of those today. All right, the key points I'm going to put here. So when we talk about our products like Duracore or Grazon PD3 or Remedy herbicide, they're all group 4 herbicides. So what does that mean? These are growth regulators. So as a plant is growing, we want to see actively growing, it disrupts that process and basically kills the plant in that mechanism. Okay. So group 4 herbicides generally don't perform well with non-growing conditions. Okay. There's many cases that would cause a dormant stage of a plant. The three I'm going to focus on right now are drought, heat, and also freezing temperatures. So let's first talk about drought or heat stress. So the stomata are the openings in a leaf, they're pictured on the right, that allow for the intake of water and nutrients, as well as the point of release for water and O2 through transpiration. So think of the stomata as kind of that fuel air mixture control that you'd have on an engine, right? As you change that, it changes the way that plant performance is going to operate. So in times of water stress and high temperatures, the stomata will close and the plant will form a waxy cuticle around the leaf to prevent water loss. So plants will slow growth and perform only the necessary functions to survive. So again, for using a group 4 herbicide, this survival response of the plants basically inhibits the mechanism that we're looking for to control those plants. So how would we combat that? There's a couple things I'd point out. I mean, you could always delay application until moisture resumes. I would also encourage in these times to use a surfactant. I like to use a surfactant all the time, but it is highly critical during these stages to use a surfactant. Jordan's going to talk to us more about that later, but that's a way to combat this survival mechanism of the plant. The third would be to use a higher rate of herbicide or more coverage. So more carrier per acre. All right, so you're good, Sven. Second one I'm going to talk about here, well, we're still here in drought, but is a response of what it looks like. Okay, so here on the left is a Canada thistle. There on the right is a species here native to the Dakotas, and that is called white sage, which looks similar to absinthe wormwood, but it's a little bit different. In both of these scenarios, there was a drought in the area. Herbicide was applied via an airplane. Okay, so it's about 2 gallons an acre. Both we're using Duracore here, and you can see that the plant has some sick conditions, but it's not enough to completely eradicate this plant. The picture there on the right, that bend, that's basically where the plant was at the growing stage when herbicide was applied. Okay, so ways to combat this, again, would be using a surfactant, possibly delaying application until a moisture event happens, and obviously using a surfactant. All right, let's talk about freeze here for a second. So I get questions all the time about when to spray in the fall and how does it relative to freezing? So again, if we kind of reel it back a little bit to it's a group 4 herbicide, we need an actively growing condition. How does freeze impact that, and what's really going on when a freeze happens? Okay, so when fall comes on, that decrease in sunlight, the change in temperature, all of those things trigger perennial and biennial plants to start putting on that last minute of sunshine into sugar storage into the roots. A light freeze can increase that rate of transfer of sunlight into sugar, and that's a really good timing to kill those plants. However, it is not the only timing. Again, if there is green actively growing conditions for those plants, we can get out there and treat regardless of that freeze. I would point out though that the harder the freeze temperature is, the more potential is for damage on those plants. And if they're severely damaged, they will be dormant and they will no longer fit in that category of actively growing plants. Typically early in the fall for us up here in the North Country, you can see a freeze, but because the ground is still warm, those plants will continue to grow until that ground is frozen. Okay. Once that ground is frozen, for me in my area, for my guys, that's really a hard stop. I have very low expectations of any control with our products beyond a hard freeze scenario. But during light freezes, still see really good control. When it comes to deciding what program to use in the fall, it's really critical, or the spring, to know which kind of plants we're dealing with. And more importantly, are they a biennial, perennial, or annual? We covered a lot of that in the 101 material, so I'm not going to go through it extensively today. But here are a couple resources highlighted to help you determine what those plants are and what the best way to go after them with a group 4 herbicide, and to reduce the amount of lack of coverage or lack of weed control in those scenarios. So use these two resources. Like it's the same resource, excuse me. The QR code leads you to that weed ID guide. I'll turn this over to Jordan now. Thank you guys.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for joining us. Apologize in advance. I've been fighting the flu for about a week now, so the voice is a little bit weak if you have a hard time hearing me. A little background about myself. I spent the past 13 years in ag retail before coming to Corteva in April of 2020. I've been here ever since. I worked pretty close with Corteva previously, their former Dow on the range and pasture side. I was a commercial applicator at a co-op. So I spent many years and many acres in the seat. Didn't really get in the air, but you know, a couple times being in Southwest Missouri. Um, but other than that, that's just my background. So we want to get into adjuvants. Question a lot is, what type of adjuvant to use for certain herbicides. Just want to kind of go through, the correct adjuvants to use for certain situations, what we come up with. So, why use an adjuvant? What is an adjuvant? I guess to start, I would say an adjuvant is anything you can add to a spray tank to increase or optimize the performance of that herbicide or insecticide that you're running, or fungicide. Um, adjuvants, they actually help optimize non-ideal spraying conditions. Most like I talk about with drought or heat conditions we can do sometimes. On some of these product failures, sometimes we look at things like high temperatures, low humidity, drought condition, dust condition on leaves, plants, growing weeds are, more common or later in growth stage. Um, we believe adjuvants are a critical piece of technology that can improve the performance of herbicides and prevent off-target movement as well. So we wanted to kind of put a poll question out there. So what adjuvants do you most commonly use in range and pasture sites? So you can select all that apply. We have our monoionics, our MSOs, crop oils, drip reduction agents, arrays. Pasture's coming in. Ben, do I need to close this?
Gotcha. Can y'all see those results?
So everybody's using NIS. We got a split between MSO and our COCs, and the majority are using DRAs. That's good.
Awesome.
And do I need to click the share results? Or do you see that popped up on your screen? So when we get into the types of adjuvants, I've actually counted about 24 different classes or 24 different types of adjuvants there are in herbicide applications, pesticide application. So when we're talking about just our surfactants, their purpose are to increase retention on the leaf surface. So as that droplet hits the leaf, we want it to stay on the leaf and spread out rather than staying in a big ball or completely bouncing, hitting the leaf, and then bouncing off. So some examples of those are standard NIS, non-allylic surfactants. There's, when you see a lot of 80/20s, 90/10s out there, there's some 95/5s. So with just general surfactants, our recommendation for use rates are a 1/4% volume, so a quart per 100 gallons water. We're jumping into the oils. These are going to be things like our COCs, our crop oil concentrates, which are derived from petroleum, and our MSOs, methylated seed oils, which are derived from plants, mostly soy oil, corn oil, stuff like that. With most of our herbicides, especially when you get into wanting to target trees and brush, we really like to use methylated seed oils, especially with Duracore. It's shown to be a lot better option as far as the surfactant goes and control of tougher weeds and trees and brush. So, with that, MSOs are more aggressive in penetrating the cuticle stressed weeds such as drought stress, heat stress. And we typically recommend about a 1% solution, so a gallon of crop oil or methylated seed oil per 100 gallons. So jump into the DRAs. There's been a lot of talk, I'd say in the last 10 years in the ag industry when it comes to dicamba, 2,4-Ds, the new technology coming out in the crop world with the Extend and Enlist platforms. So, a lot more focus on our DRAs recently. I know through the air, that's a big issue as well. So their purpose is to maintain appropriate droplet sizes to prevent off-target drift during the application. So what they'll do is once those droplets come out of the nozzle, they will actually retain, or those droplets will retain their size instead of scattering off or foaming off into a lower VMD droplet. So one big thing I will say with drift reduction agents, there are some out there on the market that I would say please pay close attention to labeled rates. I have seen several instances where we'll go double up on a DRA on drift reduction because the thinking is too much of a good thing is a good thing. Well, in some of these applications, too much drift reduction actually has adverse effects when it comes to weed control. Those droplets will actually hit the leaf and bounce off and not give the surfactants their time to perform what they need to do before that droplet hits the ground. So that's one of my big watch outs when it comes to DRAs. We also have things such as our defoamers. Typically, that's a silicate that will sit in there in the top of the tank and prevent foam on solutions, especially solutions that need to stay in constant agitation from breaking up inside the tank. I know big ones with that are going to be Roundup and those are the two worst to work with when it comes to foaming. So I always ran a defoamer in my tank running those products. So keeping herbicides on target. In this section, we're going to talk about the actual physical drift. So drift versus volatility. Abe's going to cover volatility after I get done, but for drift, drift takes place when the product applied never reaches the target. So it can happen to any product made incorrectly in poor conditions. Um, so pretty much that can be, the spray droplets drift off target to another side because the wind's too high. It can be, things such as your droplet size is too small on the of the micron, like 150 below. You can have droplets that never even touch the surface. They'll just sit there and float. So here's a good classification chart for droplet size, going from extremely fine to ultra coarse. So when we talk smaller the droplet, we're going to have more driftable fines. So you look there, anything very fine and below, that's where we can start running into some trouble with upward movement. I'll say our target, what we typically shoot for is about 325 to 350 or higher. Another factor that impacts some of our off-target movement or drift, release height. Releasing too high can leave, many particles up to environmental variations, such as, temperature inversions. The wind could be blowing higher at, 30-foot elevation than it is at 10-foot elevation off the ground. And we base all these off target height, not off the ground height. Temperature inversions. What is a temperature inversion? It's where you have a hot layer of air trapped between two cool packs of air. Um, and what these do is, as the day goes on, typically in the morning is where I've seen more of these. As that warm air is coming up, it's actually taking those smaller droplet or those, non-driftable fines up and moving them off target with the wind. So they never actually touch the surface of what you're going for. Key watch out for that, avoid early morning or late evening sprays. Typically what I say is when the dew comes off in the morning, you can go out and spray, or once the dew starts to set, I would probably look at shutting it down. And then a big thing with these is avoid winds below 3 miles an hour. Because anything below 3 miles an hour, the smaller droplets are not going to be reaching the target site. So some good watch outs on how to spot an inversion. So look at things like suspended fog. So sometimes in the morning as that dew's coming off with fog out there. I mean, it's not very ideal situations, right? And then rapid temperature changes from afternoon to evening. So even in the morning when it's really cool and then the sun comes out, gets hot, that can be some time to look for an inversion, or in the evening time when it really starts to cool down after the sun goes down, you get that inversion. Uh, Factors there too. So some areas where these are really big, or bigger watchouts are going to be your ravines, valleys, basins, um, lower spots, including draws, places like that. You're on mute, Abe.
I'll go now. I just need to unmute myself. My name is Abe Smith. I'm a territory manager for most of Nebraska and all of Iowa for Range and Pasture Products. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and we'll just pick up the conversation from there. But I've been in the industry for it's my 28th season. The majority of those have been in the range and pasture business, and it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with folks interested in application technology. One of the other things I would go back and say just about inversions is that planes, with their ability to release a little bit of smoke, they have a easy way to be able to check if there's inversion conditions out there. If you're piloting drones or some other ways, you may need to look into little smoke release or some canisters to be able to assess if you're in a situation where you think there may be inversion conditions. Those tools are out there. And so it's always good to have tools available for you. We wanted to take time to delineate the difference between drift and volatility because in the conversations that we get into with customers, there oftentimes is a lot of confusion as to the difference between drift and volatility. Well, that just volatilized over onto the customer's field. In some cases, more commonly, it is drift, where material has actually physically been applied and it has actually drifted before it's landed onto the other side of the field. Volatilization is this product's interaction with the environment around it, which allows vapors to leave the target site after landing on the leaf or soil. So after that material has actually been deposited onto the plant material, there's oftentimes heat and humidity conditions that arise where it actually will push that back off the leaf into the air into atomized particles and then can actually drift, be pushed by the winds to a place that's undetermined. So even though you might have done a really, really nice job of application, there are products out there that can volatilize. And most commonly, ones we associate with that today are dicambas. But there are conditions that other things can be influenced by that. So the factors that influence volatility, the product that's being applied, like dicamba, perhaps even in some cases, remedy may be one of those products that could be susceptible to that. And then conditions at the time of application. Go ahead, Sven. So what are the factors that impact volatility? Chemical products, chemical properties of the products applied. So in this case, let's just compare a 240 ester to a 240 amine to a 240 choline. Now you're probably familiar with 240 esters. You can buy 5-pound ester or 6-pound ester readily in 240s. You can also buy 240 cholines, and you're probably most familiar with those out of the Enlist lineup of chemistries. So whether you're utilizing a Grazon PD3 or maybe you've seen some experience in the crop world with Enlist 1, cholines function differently than how an ester or an amine may work. And so the terms do refer to the timeline of herbicide history, but there are different forms of that. So an ester is an oil-based formulation that tends to be more readily volatilized, whereas amines are salt crystals. Once they dry down, you actually get a salt crystal, and cholines are something different and unique out of that. So you do have to take into consideration when you're choosing between an ester or an amine or potentially a choline if you're concerned about volatility. We've actually done a variety of humidome studies, which is a fancy way to say that we can help create the conditions or study how things volatilize, and we can actually pull things through. And we created these situations in a greenhouse sort of situation to accentuate high humidity, high temperatures, and really give you a good sense of what sort of things might be more volatile versus not. So in the case of Triclopyr here, this might be a product you may not be familiar with Garlon 3A, but we do have an amine form of Garlon. Tomatoes after 11 days of exposure in this humidome where it's just sucking across air that maybe amines could potentially volatilize in a hot, humid situation. Probably not one we would naturally find, but you can see on the right an untreated tomato, and then on the left tomatoes that have sat in a humidome under really magnified conditions of humidity and heat. So yes, we do even see some impacts of volatility with an amine form of Triclopyr. Go ahead, Sven. At 12 days, you're starting to see that with choline in a similar sort of timeline, utilizing things, the Triclopyr choline, we actually see very little impact of that volatility versus the untreated on that. I wouldn't say we've seen none of that, but we probably do see some, all right? Some very minor stuff. The cholines that we do have available out there for use and application Grazon PD3, which is picloram plus a 2,4-D choline. We target that for spurge and brush control. Picloram on its own, in the form that it's in, is listed as a non-volatile chemistry on its own. And so we're not concerned about volatility with picloram. You put that together with a 2,4-D choline, you have something that is extremely low risk compared to maybe a Grazon P plus D that you may be familiar with. So when you're dealing in situations where you want to have a high degree of certainty that you're not going to be exposed to volatility concerns, Grazon PD3 is a pretty solid choice overall. It does a nice job, a little bit lower use rate as well, and definitely a lower odor formulation than what you would have in your old school Grazon P plus D. The second product we have is called Freelex. It is our 2,4-D choline version for range and pasture. It's a very low volatility tank mix partner for use with a variety of pasture products, or in a standalone version for customers that may be concerned about long residuals or spraying adjacent to crops where they can't have a long residual. A Freelex may make a good choice. Freelex is a little bit more difficult to get a hold of. It's not broadly available. We try and steward this very well to ensure that we keep Freelex in a range and pasture market and not in areas where Freelex is not intended to be sold. So the factors that impact volatility specifically, we think of high temperatures. Once you get above 85 degrees overall, we start to see volatility get to be a very normal and common concern. And then other areas, low relative humidity. I think lower relative humidity is better than high relative humidity. There's a density into the air, and we see materials more readily come off and gas off into that. And some of that, the moisture in that air is more easily steered and turned other places. If you make applications onto these bare ground situations like gravel, fallow ground, areas that don't have a lot of surface area to them relative to the nooks and crannies that we find on a lot of plant leafy material. If you're spraying a pasture, your surface area on a pasture is much significantly greater than just a flat piece of ground. So those open areas where we see more material overall, where it's not spread out as thinly, perhaps, relatively speaking, those are areas where we may see more susceptible to volatility. So to avoid drift and volatility issues, number one, check your weather forecast for application dates. If you know you've got open time coming up the following week and you're seeing either high humidities that whole time, temperatures, you're pushing temperatures into the 90s and hundreds, not only may you see reduced efficacy because of high temperatures, you may also see reduced or increased issues with potential volatility and drift, unintended drift, number one, in terms of high temperatures. At high temperatures, aerial applications at 2 gallon an acre effectively start to reduce that effective application rate. So that 2 gallon an acre might go down to 1.75 gallon an acre because of the evaporation that may take place during the application. But also the volatility issues tend to become very significant, that once that's set down on that leaf, heat and humidity can push that back off into the atmosphere. And really, depending on the winds, there's no predictability as to where the volatility may be pushed. It's going to depend on where you're, guessing wise, you'd probably say, well, where the predominant winds are going to come from, it's going to push away from where they're coming from to where they normally go. So please read and follow the product label on drift and volatility precautions if you have specific things you're trying to mitigate your risk on and carry out your best practices on. Sven? As we kind of head towards wrapping things up, it's 10:40. I see we've got a couple questions to consider answering. I do want to give you some thoughts just about if you're newer to the range and pasture game, if you're newer to the range and pasture application business, it's a good time to be considering fall applications. And we've actually had a really interesting year in that we've had a lot of moisture this year. We had a very good run for application in the spring. But as the summer's gone on, we've seen things start to dry out. And in talking to one of my old mentors, he sees with the drought we're kind of settling into now, unless things really reverse course, we are really teed up towards having an epic ragweed run. We're going to have more ragweed than we know to shake a stick at, so to speak, forming this fall. Our thistle crop is looking excellent. If only we had a cash market for it. We're going to be looking at a lot of thistles to spray either this fall or next spring as we get maybe further into a drought. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and customers may be thinking, oh, I treated my pasture this spring. I don't need to touch it. I don't need to do anything. I don't need to manage it. The reality is they would be well advised, and you would be well advised to scout those pastures again. See what sort of condition they're in going into the fall. Check and validate if they do have weeds or not. They may not, but more often than not, there's a heck of a lot more weeds out there, especially with the pressures that have been put on pastures here at the end of the summer as we've kind of entered into that drought phase. Go to your next slide there, Spen. A couple other things we want to point out for applicators and people that are connected to the range and pasture business here. There are reasons that people do business with us to grow with Corteva. And we just want to make note of things. We're not going to do an in-depth presentation here, but I do want you to think about if you're newer to the game, newer to the application realm, there are some tools that you may have at your disposal that we haven't had an opportunity to introduce to you yet. And so we want to make you aware of, we do have tools, things like rebate programs, our Retail Advantage program, that if you're a customer that is EDIing sales, and that's a specific term, that means you buy through an approved distribution channel, you may qualify for retail programs or a rebate program with as little as $10,000 of purchases of Corteva products. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to us, contact us. We want to help understand what your situation is, perhaps where you're purchasing products through. And if you qualify for programs, we want to make sure you have those tools available to you. It's one of the primary reasons that folks choose to work with Corteva, but not the only reason. The second one would be skunk works. If you have issues that you're trying to wrap your head around or specific weed problems that you're looking to understand, research, ask us. We do have some resources available. We've done plots with customers. We've tried to be very creative at times in terms of trying to come up with tank mixes that would work or be effective on certain weeds. So occasionally we will sponsor plots, or we will sponsor some product to be deployed in the effort of trying to expand our knowledge, because our R&D team is busy with some very specific tasks they're charged to answer, but we occasionally will outsource that, so to speak, and we'll utilize folks like you to help leverage our knowledge of products if we find some agreeable situations to do that. And third, equipment support. We do have, if you're using larger volumes of product, specifically moving product out of totes or IBCs, we do have ability to help fund some of those costs that you come into, whether that's pumps, meters, scales. And as things scale up from there, there may be other opportunities. But we would like to talk with you about those opportunities. If you qualify for Retail Advantage programs, you may be a customer that could be targeted for some equipment support as well. That gets to be pretty important as you're getting up to speed and learning about this business very quickly. Sometimes that could be in a more traditional sprayer situation. Sometimes that might be as simple as helping sponsor some AI air induction nozzles on some ground equipment. That could look a lot of different ways. With drones and such, we're just getting our feet wet into this business as well. But we do want to have those conversations with you if you can identify needs specific to the range and pasture business where we have opportunity to grow together. Okay. So if you do have questions, please throw them into the Q&A over there. if you click on the Q&A tab, you can ask a couple questions. The first one that I had teed up here is specific to what are the best options for controlling cedar trees in pastures? Various sizes, 1 foot to 8 foot, please and thanks, and appreciate the question. And I'll give an answer here. I think we can kind of go around the horn between Tanner, Jordan, and I and a little bit because I think we may have some different takes on it. Just understand number one, cedar trees have no silver bullet out there today. Cedar trees are unique in that they're in the juniper family and they're not your run-of-the-mill coniferous sort of trees. So we do take some different approaches to that, but generally speaking, I've used products like Surmount primarily, something that's picloram based. It's going to be a restricted use product for that people that might be concerned about that situation. But we're doing a lot of individual plant treatments. I don't know of any broadcast scenario that works extremely well in that scenario, but we've done things around Surmount. So starting at 3 pints of Surmount, maybe, and more likely going up to that 6 pints of Surmount per acre. Utilizing volume to volume treatments, probably in the 4% sort of rate of Surmount. And sometimes we're tank mixing things like metsulfuron or ally into that as well, which you'd have to be cautious of depending on where you're at, because there are grasses that are more sensitive to metsulfuron. And so oftentimes that's best discussed individual to individual, voice to voice, so we can help you calibrate that specific recommendation for your area. Tanner, would you take the next swing at that?
Yeah, Abe, I think you're kind of on the lines of where I'm thinking as well. Really, the only things I would add is because there's not a silver bullet. These applications usually require multiple follow-ups. So whether that's once per year for a few years in a row, or even spraying twice in the same year, two different products, that's usually been the best results. Whenever we talk about aerial equipment, we have reduced carrier volume. Where that may work completely fine with weeds, brush and trees can be very difficult at very low volumes of carrier. So if we're talking, the traditional 2 to 5 gallons an acre for weeds, ideally we see the best results, like 15 gallons an acre. That may not be possible with your type of application and be feasible to do that, but something to consider, that there is a principle there of the more coverage, usually the better results we're going to get with cedar trees. Certainly, if you're more towards the 1 foot high section, I'd expect better with less amount of water. But when you get into the 8 foot size, some considerations there. As far as timing goes, there's usually a pretty broad window for controlling cedars, being that they're coniferous. Reach out to us. Let's talk about that program. But again, to my point earlier on weed control, exceptionally dry years are not usually the most favorable for having a herbicide application on cedars. If you're going to spend money and use a herbicide, I would wait for those more average moisture to higher moisture periods. Is what I would recommend. And that way you can use higher rates as well and not have as much response on the grass that'll be underneath it. Go ahead, Jordan, if you had anything to add on that point.
Yeah, I was going to add that is the tough problem when it comes to controlling cedars is grass safety. There's herbicides out there that will control them, but the grass around them will not be around. It's going to kill them. So typically what I do on my place is I grab a repeater syringe, an old Allflex repeater syringe, 50 cc cattle syringe, and I do 1 to 2 cc just at the base of them for every foot of height. Generally that, works better on smaller ones, but if you hit them long enough, you can get them that way easily. If you're going to be hand spraying them, high volume with a hand wand, it's 1 or 2% Surmount.
Spen, do you see any other questions there in the chat?
Yeah, so I've got one. We kind of touched on it a little bit, talking about Duracore versus Grazon Next. Kind of how do those two products fit in? What's the dynamic there, and which one's ideal out of an aerial situation.
Go ahead, Tanner.
Sure. Abe kind of mentioned this in what he's talking about as far as volatility. That really comes first to mind for me in comparing those two products. They share a lot of similarities, to be honest. I mean, they both are based with milestone. So as far as a weed control spectrum, a length of control, all of those, as long as we're using similar rates, I wouldn't have a lot of differences in expectations in that regard. Um, but certainly the formulation makes a big difference, especially coming out of aerial equipment. Duracore would be ranked as a non-volatile product, reduced risk of that moving off target. Anecdotally, folks that I spray with pretty closely always tell me that they're, pilots, that they like how Duracore lays down better. Again, that's an anecdotal response. I haven't been up in the airplane myself, but it is not uncommon for me to hear that from multiple sources. Grazon Next has 2,4-D in it. If you're unfamiliar with that, there's just a potential for that to move around. Amine formulations typically have, about, a 30 to 50% potential on an 85-degree day to move around. That could result in getting up in the air, touching some trees, moving over to a bean field. There's just a potential there. So I would encourage Duracore as far as a safety aspect and still be comfortable with the weed spectrum that it has. And in many cases, it controls more than just Grazon Next would.
I would just add that if you're dealing with locust trees, Duracore is the hands down choice between the two. Duracore is a dominant herbicide on locust trees. If you're in Iowa and you're dealing with poison hemlock, it is absolutely should be Duracore almost exclusively. Poison hemlock and wild parsnip both would fall into that category. It's a better chemistry overall on those three weeds, and that's usually enough to have people really consider of centering their program around a Duracore, because it works exceptionally well on not only that, but then your more standard Canada thistle and your ragweeds and things like that. It performs as good as what we've seen out of Grazon Next HL over the years.
Since you guys are talking Duracord, we're an aerial application webinar. I figured I would throw out there. I did have 3 aerial applicators this year. I did get to switch from Grazon Next to Duracore, and all 3 of them had to decrease their swath width on their planes by 10 feet each pass because he streaked a couple of fields. If that, I mean, any testament to how much better Duracore falls out of a plane through the air than what Grazon Next does.
Excellent. Spend one more before we call it.
Yeah, so I've got one here, kind of leafy spurge. I know it's a little bit more regional specific, kind of further up in the Dakotas and a little bit south of that, but is now the time to treat it? What's that look like in terms of the best window for spurge?
Sure, I can take that one. It's definitely weed we see every day up here. Right now, so like I said, I'm from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I spend a lot of time usually north of there and a little bit east. Now is really the beginnings of spring leafy spurge. Like I said earlier, once those free cycles start, the rate of transfer from sunlight to sugar reserves in the roots increases until it completely stops at that hard freeze. So, in short, yes, spray leafy spurge. My products of choice out of an airplane are going to be Grazon PD3. And then second would be Tordon mixed with probably Freelex if you want to mix your own. And spray now, use a surfactant, and keep spraying until conditions are dormant.
Awesome.
I saw we had one more pop in here, right? I have a question on how do you control willow saplings? We have a hard time with willows creeping up hillsides across pastures and are super hardy, and you kill them and they come back. It's a good question. We get a lot of willows, and we may have some flexibility in our geography that you may not have because the question's out of central Washington. We tend to see 2 things. Number one, products like Remedy can be useful for burning those back, especially small ones. Small to medium-sized ones, we've done a pint to 2 pints, but pint usually will control the little sapling ones, or at least burn them back. Sometimes we're pairing that with a 2,4-D just to get a little bit more growth regulator out there. So maybe a pint and a quart of 2,4-D, depending on your situation. But the other product that we tend to see out here that you may not have, depending on your location, Tordon 22K or things like Grazon PD3 would be viable options to consider. Tordon seems to have a pretty good effect on reducing willows out there. It's one of those things sometimes you gotta make the right product choice for the right situation. So sometimes 8 to 12 ounces of Tordon with a pound of D does a fine job of burning those willows back and mitigating some of their impact. The problem, as you note, is that they keep coming. They come back and back and back. And I'm not sure of any way to stop them indefinitely in that situation, but clearly by just manage them on a timely basis, you can mitigate the spread of them pretty well overall. Anyone else have any comments on that?
Yeah, I'll take that for a minute. So in Minnesota, we have a lot of willows. I'm not sure if it's the same subspecies you have in Washington, but I imagine there's a lot of similarities. But we've had really good results by using a pint of Remedy, like Abe mentioned. But we also pair it with a pint of Duracore, which helps with that residual mechanism there in the roots as well. Many folks have liked that for winning back their pastures with brush. I'm not saying this is your 10-foot willow, but certainly those younger willows, this has been a good program. And I'd focus on those really good leafed out periods. For us, usually between June and mid-September is usually the ideal window for us.
Cool. Well, yeah,
That's really one of the secret treatments that has really developed a following here in the last handful of years is a pint of Duracore and a pint of Remedy for weeds and brush together. And guys, if you want something that's kind of an all-around all-star treatment, that's where it's at. It has been really good on these mixed weed and brush approaches.
awesome. Good deal. Jordan, I think we got a question there. What does that say?
You know, someone's asking in the chat, is Grazon Next available with a choline form of 2,4-D? And the answer is no, not at this time. I think the reality is that we've shifted a lot of that business to Duracore without the 2,4-D. Duracore is aminopyrrolide plus Rinskor, which is a newer active ingredient that fulfills a lot of what the 2,4-D brings to the table. There may be some situations that we've been mixing Freelex with Duracore in some of those situations, maybe for specific weeds, but Duracore on its own has fulfilled a lot of the niche of where folks might look for a milestone with a Freelex type option.
I would point out as well, though, there is a product called Grazon PD3 that we've mentioned a few times. That does include a choline 2,4-D formulation, but instead of paired with Milestone, it's paired with Tordon 22K. So really a great product for brush, leafy spurge, field bindweed. Those are the ones that kind of come to mind there, but not a Milestone choline 2,4-D pairing currently.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, no, that's all the questions that I've seen come across. And if you have a second before we wrap things up, I've shared a link to ShowPad in the chat a little bit further up. So if you have any need for resources, feel free to save that link on your desktop and access those resources year round. And as always, feel free to give your ranger pasture specialist a call. We're more than happy to help with anything with anything y'all come across in the field. So thank y'all for joining us, and feel free to look back at our 101 session. You'll see the links coming through your inbox, as well as an announcement for our door prize winners. So with that, I'd like to wrap it up, and thank y'all for joining us this morning, and hope you have a good rest of your week.
Thank you.
Bye now, folks.